The first thing Calvin Brooks tasted that morning was not the pancake, not the butter, not even the coffee gone cold beside his hand, but betrayal. At 6:17 a.m., the little brass bell above the glass door of Morning Grace Diner gave a soft, cheerful ring, the kind of sound meant to welcome people in from the street, but no one behind the counter looked happy to see the man who stepped inside. He was a black man in his early 50s, dressed in a faded brown jacket, plain work pants, and scuffed shoes that looked like they had crossed more bus stations than boardrooms. His gray beard was trimmed short, his shoulders slightly rounded, and his eyes stayed calm as they moved across the room, taking in everything: the polished wood booths, the framed newspaper reviews, the smell of bacon, the hiss of the espresso machine, the warm yellow lights that made the place look kinder than it was. Behind the hostess stand, Diane Whitmore looked him up and down as if he had tracked mud across her clean floor, though his shoes were dry. She did not smile. She did not say good morning. She only lifted one eyebrow and asked, "Table for one?" in the tired voice of someone already hoping the answer would be no. Calvin nodded. "Just breakfast." A young couple in business clothes came in behind him, laughing softly, and Diane's face changed instantly. Her smile appeared like a switch had been flipped. "Good morning, welcome in," she said to them, warm as fresh syrup. Then she turned back to Calvin and pointed toward a small table near the hallway that led to the restrooms. "You can sit there." It was the worst table in the diner, half hidden beside a mop closet, where the overhead vent blew too cold and the smell of cleaning solution cut through the aroma of coffee. Calvin walked to it without complaint. That was the first thing that bothered them. Men who felt insulted usually showed it. They raised their voice, demanded better, asked for a manager. Calvin did none of that. He removed his jacket slowly, folded it over the chair, and sat down with the quiet patience of a man who had learned long ago that silence could make guilty people expose themselves. From the counter, Diane leaned toward Richard Harlan, the regional manager, a tall white man in a navy suit too expensive for a breakfast shift. She whispered something, and both of them glanced at Calvin. Richard gave a thin little smile and said just loud enough for nearby employees to hear, "Some people wander into the wrong places before they check the prices." A few workers laughed under their breath. Calvin looked down at the menu, where his mother's recipe sat under a gold label: Southern honey butter pancakes, the first dish Morning Grace had ever sold, the dish that built the company before the company had offices, investors, or a name anyone knew. A waitress named Maya Johnson approached him with a coffee pot, her expression careful, almost apologetic. She was young, no more than 24, with tired eyes and a name tag slightly crooked on her uniform. "Coffee, sir?" she asked. "Please," Calvin said. She poured, then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry about the table." Calvin looked up at her, and for the first time that morning, something gentle crossed his face. "You didn't choose it." Maya hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but Diane called her name sharply from across the room. Maya stepped back. "I'll give you a minute." Calvin did not need a minute. He already knew what he had come for. For 3 months, anonymous complaints had reached his private office: black customers seated last, older guests ignored, workers of color given the worst shifts, refunds deleted from the system, food quality slipping in ways the official reports never showed. So Calvin Brooks, founder and owner of the entire Morning Grace Diner Group, had come undercover to eat breakfast in his own restaurant. He expected arrogance. He expected disrespect. He even expected Richard Harlan to be worse than the numbers suggested. What he did not expect was the smell drifting from the kitchen when Maya placed the pancakes in front of him. They looked perfect at first: golden edges, melting butter, a glossy amber sauce running down the stack like sunlight. But Calvin had grown up around this recipe. He knew the scent of real honey before he knew the smell of money. He cut a small piece, lifted it slowly, and took one bite. His face did not change much, but his fingers tightened around the fork. Beneath the sweetness was a bitter metallic note, faint but unmistakable, hidden under cheap vanilla and heat. Calvin lowered the fork to the plate and stared toward the kitchen doors. For the first time that morning, the man everyone thought was harmless went completely still. Calvin kept the piece of pancake in his mouth for 1 second longer than he wanted to, not because he was hungry, but because every detail mattered now. The texture was wrong. The sauce was too slick, too thin, too sharp at the back of the tongue. Real honey softened as it warmed. This left a faint burn behind the sweetness, the kind of taste a person might miss if they were eating fast, talking, distracted by children, phones, or morning traffic outside the window. Calvin swallowed slowly and reached for the coffee. It was lukewarm. He took a small sip anyway, letting the bitterness clear his mouth while his eyes stayed on the swinging kitchen doors. Behind them, metal pans clattered, a cook called out an order, and somewhere deeper in the back, a plastic container scraped across the floor. Nothing about the sound was unusual, and that made it worse. Whatever was happening here had become routine. At the counter, Richard Harlan checked his watch, then leaned over the service station where Diane was folding napkins with hard, impatient movements. "He is still sitting there," Diane muttered. Richard did not look at Calvin directly. He used the reflection in the chrome coffee machine, careful the way people are when they think they are clever. Let him finish and go. Do not waste the good service on a $5 tip. Diane laughed softly. If he tips at all. Calvin heard every word. He had spent 30 years in restaurants, from dish pits to executive meetings, and he knew how people sounded when kindness was only part of the uniform. He cut another tiny corner from the pancake, but this time he did not eat it. He pressed it gently against the side of the plate, watching the amber sauce separate into a glossy layer and a cloudy streak that should not have been there. His mother's sauce never separated. Evelyn Brooks used to make it in a dented saucepan on Sunday mornings in Birmingham, stirring with one hand while holding church flyers in the other, telling him that food had a memory. If you changed the ingredients, she said, the truth would rise to the surface. Calvin looked around the dining room. A white couple near the front window received fresh coffee without asking. A delivery driver in a worn jacket waited by the register while 3 employees ignored him. An older black man 2 booths away lifted his empty mug, and Diane walked past him as if the mug were invisible. The old man lowered it with the quiet embarrassment of someone used to being overlooked. Calvin's jaw tightened, but still he said nothing. He had not come to punish rudeness. He had come to understand a pattern. Now the pattern had a smell, a taste, and a plate number printed on the receipt beneath his water glass. Maya returned with a small pitcher of syrup, though Calvin had not asked for one. Her hand trembled just enough for him to notice. "They said you might want extra," she said. Her voice was polite, but her eyes flicked toward the kitchen. Calvin studied her for a moment. "Is this the same sauce that comes on the pancakes?" Maya's lips parted, then closed. Across the room, Diane was watching. Richard was watching too. Maya placed the pitcher on the table and spoke so softly that the words barely rose above the air vent. "Please do not use that." Calvin did not move. "Why?" Maya swallowed. "I cannot say here." Before Calvin could answer, Diane snapped, "Maya, order up." The young waitress stepped away too quickly, leaving the little pitcher beside his plate like evidence. Calvin picked it up and tilted it under the light. The liquid moved strangely, not slow like honey, not clean like syrup. It clung to the glass in uneven ribbons, and at the bottom, there was a thin pale film. A cold weight settled in his chest. Across the diner, a little girl in a pink school sweatshirt climbed into a booth with her mother and pointed excitedly at the picture of the same pancakes on the menu. The mother smiled, tired but warm, and tucked the child's backpack beside her feet. Calvin watched as Diane approached them with a bright voice she had never offered him. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" The little girl tapped the menu. "Those pancakes, please." Calvin looked down at his plate, then toward the kitchen, then back at the child. The insult at his table no longer mattered. The bad coffee no longer mattered. Even Richard Harlan no longer mattered as a man. Something was moving through this restaurant under the cover of breakfast, and Calvin Brooks had just realized that if he waited too long, the next person to taste the truth might be someone too small to understand the danger. Calvin watched the little girl swing her feet beneath the booth while her mother tried to smooth a strand of hair from the child's face. The girl could not have been more than 7, maybe 8, with a purple backpack, light-up sneakers, and the kind of morning excitement that made breakfast feel like a holiday. She did not know that a grown man across the room was measuring every second between her order and the kitchen door. She did not know that the pancakes she had chosen carried the same glossy sauce sitting untouched on Calvin's table. And she certainly did not know that the quiet man near the hallway had built this restaurant so families like hers could feel safe inside it. Calvin folded his napkin once, then twice, buying himself a moment to think. He needed proof, not suspicion. Suspicion got dismissed in boardrooms. Proof shut doors, sealed kitchens, and protected customers. His eyes moved to the framed photographs along the wall, the First Morning Grace location in 1998, the ribbon cutting in Atlanta, his mother Evelyn smiling beside a stack of pancakes taller than her coffee mug. The photograph had been taken before investors, before expansion, before people like Richard Harlan learned how to turn hospitality into numbers on a spreadsheet. Back then, every jar of honey came from a farm 70 miles outside Birmingham, every bag of flour was checked by hand, and every customer was greeted the same way because Evelyn Brooks believed hunger humbled everybody. A table does not care how much money is in your pocket, she used to say. So, neither should the person serving it. Calvin looked away from the photo just as Richard crossed the dining room toward him. The manager moved with the polished confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him. His shoes shined under the warm lights. His smile was thin, professional, and empty. "Everything all right here, sir?" Richard asked. He placed just enough weight on the word sir to make it sound like an insult wearing a tie. Calvin looked up slowly. "There is something off about the sauce." Richard's face did not change, but his eyes did. For half a second, the smile lost its shape. "Our guests love that sauce. Do they know what is in it?" Calvin asked. Diane stopped wiping the counter. Maya froze near the coffee station. The kitchen doors swung open, and a pale young cook with reddish hair stepped out carrying 2 plates. Evan Miller. Calvin recognized him from the employee files, though the man had looked more confident in his official photograph. In person, Evan kept his shoulders tight and his eyes low, as if he had trained himself not to notice what passed through his own hands. Richard leaned closer to Calvin's table. "Maybe the flavor is just not what you are used to." Calvin let the sentence hang there. Around them, forks scraped plates, coffee poured, chairs shifted, and yet a small pocket of silence formed between the 2 men. "Maybe," Calvin said. "Or maybe somebody changed the recipe." Richard gave a short laugh. "Sir, with respect, you are eating pancakes, not conducting a federal investigation." Diane laughed too quickly from the counter. Calvin smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with recognition. People always told on themselves when they felt cornered. He turned his gaze to Maya, who was now pretending to arrange sugar packets. Her hands were shaking. Richard noticed him looking and straightened. "Maya, do you not have tables to check?" "Yes, Mr. Harlan," she said. Her voice was small. Calvin filed that away too. "Mr. Harlan. Not Richard. Not manager." The tone of a workplace where fear had become part of the uniform. Then the kitchen bell rang. Evan placed a fresh stack of pancakes on the service counter, golden and steaming, with the same amber sauce sliding over the top. Diane picked up the plate and carried it toward the little girl's booth. Calvin felt the room narrow. The lights, the conversations, the smell of bacon and coffee, everything seemed to pull back until only that plate remained. He stood. The chair legs made a quiet scrape against the floor. Richard's head turned. "Is there a problem?" Calvin did not answer him. He walked toward the service counter, not fast enough to cause alarm, not slow enough to be stopped by uncertainty. Diane saw him coming and stiffened. "Sir, you need to return to your table." Calvin's eyes stayed on the plate in her hands. "Do not serve that yet." Diane blinked, offended by the calm authority in his voice. "Excuse me." Richard stepped in behind him, lowering his voice. "You are starting to disturb paying customers." Calvin finally turned. "Then you should be grateful I am still speaking quietly." For the first time that morning, Richard had no answer. The little girl's mother looked up, confused, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. Maya stood near the coffee station, her face pale with fear and relief at the same time. Calvin looked at the pancakes, then at Evan, then at Richard. The truth was not fully visible yet, but it was close. It was in the cloudy sauce, in Maya's warning, in Evan's lowered eyes, and in Richard's sudden need to control the room. Calvin reached into his pocket and touched the small evidence file he had brought with him, the kind used during private food safety audits. He had planned to use it quietly. Now, as Diane held that plate inches from a child's table, quiet was no longer enough. Calvin did not raise his voice, but the dining room changed the moment he reached into his pocket. It was not fear yet. It was curiosity, the slow turning of heads, the lowering of forks, the pause that moves through a room when ordinary people sense that an ordinary morning has slipped out of its normal shape. Diane still held the plate in both hands, the pancakes trembling slightly as the sauce slid down the sides in shiny golden lines. "Sir, this is completely inappropriate," she said, though her voice had lost some of its sharpness. Calvin took out the small clear vial, twisted off the cap, and held it beside the plate. "Then it should be easy to prove I am wrong." Richard stepped closer, his smile gone now. "You are not authorized to touch food that belongs to another customer." Calvin looked at him. "Neither are you authorized to serve food that may be unsafe." The word unsafe landed harder than any accusation. The mother in the booth pulled her daughter closer. A man near the window set down his coffee. Maya covered her mouth with one hand, not in shock, but in the exhausted relief of someone who had been waiting for the truth to finally enter the room. Richard noticed every reaction. His face tightened. "This gentleman is confused," he announced, turning slightly so the other guests could hear. "We take quality very seriously here." Calvin dipped the clean plastic strip from the vial kit into a drop of sauce at the edge of the plate. Diane gasped as if he had broken something sacred, but she did not move to stop him. No one did. The strip darkened where it touched the sauce, not dramatically, not enough for the room to understand, but enough for Calvin. He had used these kits in surprise inspections before. They did not tell the whole story, but they told when a story needed to be stopped. The indicator shifted from pale yellow to a dull orange shade that should never appear on food labeled organic honey butter. Calvin slipped the strip into the vial, sealed it, and placed it in his jacket pocket. "Where is the original container?" he asked. Richard laughed once, a dry sound with no humor in it. "You walk in here, take a bite of breakfast, and now you think you can interrogate my staff?" "Your staff?" Calvin repeated quietly. Richard's jaw flexed. "Yes. My staff. My restaurant. My shift. And I am asking you to leave before this becomes embarrassing." The sentence pulled a cold stillness from Calvin. For a moment, the restaurant around him disappeared, replaced by another kitchen decades earlier, much smaller, much hotter, with fogged windows and a radio playing gospel music on a Sunday morning. He was 15 again, standing beside his mother before sunrise. Watching her pour batter onto a black griddle that had belonged to her mother before her. Evelyn Brooks never measured with fancy tools. She measured by memory, by scent, by the way batter moved when it was right. She had worked 2 jobs and still woke early to feed people after church, truck drivers before dawn, nurses coming off night shifts, old men who paid in coins and children who paid in smiles. Calvin remembered the first time a man in a suit told her she should charge more to people who looked like they could afford it. Evelyn had looked at him over her glasses and said, "Baby, hunger does not come in rich and poor. It just comes." That was the sentence Calvin built Morning Grace on. Not profit. Not branding. Not regional expansion. A table, a plate, a promise. And now Richard Harlan stood in the middle of that promise, calling it his. Calvin returned to the present with the same calm face, but his eyes had changed. "Bring me the container," he said. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Calvin and Diane could hear. "Listen to me carefully. I do not know what kind of stunt you are trying to pull, but people like you do not get to walk into a business and make demands." Diane looked away, but not before Calvin saw the small satisfied flicker in her expression. There it was, fully exposed at last. Not a misunderstanding. Not bad training. Not stress from a busy morning. Contempt. Calvin turned slightly toward the little girl's mother. "Ma'am, please do not let your daughter eat anything with that sauce until it has been checked." The mother nodded quickly, sliding the plate away from the child. Richard's face reddened. "That is enough." He pointed toward the front door. "Get out." Calvin reached for his phone, but before he could unlock it, the kitchen doors swung open again. Evan Miller appeared carrying a white plastic jug with no label, no seal, and no delivery sticker. He stopped when he saw the room staring. For one silent second, the jug hung from his hand like an answer nobody wanted to read. Maya whispered from behind the counter, "That is the one." Richard turned sharply toward her. "Maya." But it was too late. Calvin had seen it. The guests had seen it. And for the first time since he stepped through the door, the people who had mocked him began to understand that the quiet man near the restroom table had not come in looking for breakfast. He had come in looking for the truth, and the truth had just walked out of the kitchen in a white plastic jug. The white jug did not look dangerous. That was what made the room feel colder. It was ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of container people walked past in storerooms every day without asking questions. No warning label. No brand. No farm name. No lot number. Just cloudy plastic, a screw cap, and a thin line of amber liquid clinging to the inside like something trying not to be seen. Evan Miller stood frozen between the kitchen doors, his red hair tucked under a paper cap, his apron marked with flour near the waist. His eyes went first to Richard, then to Diane, then to Calvin, and in that quick little triangle of panic, Calvin understood the chain of command better than any report could have explained it. Evan was not the architect. Diane was not the architect. They were pieces. Richard was the man keeping the pieces moving. "Take that back to the kitchen," Richard said, each word controlled and quiet. Evan swallowed. "You told me to bring out the refill." "I said take it back." The sharpness in Richard's voice made the little girl at the booth shrink closer to her mother, and Calvin stepped half a pace between them and the service counter. Not dramatically. Not like a threat. Just enough to make the room understand where he stood. Maya moved from behind the coffee station before anyone could stop her. "That is what they started using 6 weeks ago," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Diane spun toward her. "Maya, stop talking." Maya kept her eyes on Calvin, as if she had decided he was the safest place in the room. The real honey stopped coming. Mr. Harlan said the supplier changed, but the boxes never had company labels. The invoices looked different. "I asked about it once, and my hours got cut from 38 a week to 16. A murmur passed through the diners. Richard raised both hands in a polished gesture of disbelief. "She is upset because of a scheduling issue. That is all this is." Calvin did not look away from the jug. "Evan, put it on the counter." Evan did not move. Richard answered for him. "He will do no such thing." Calvin turned then, slowly, fully, and faced Richard Harlan. A child was about to be served from that container. You should be the first person asking what is inside it. For a moment, something ugly flickered behind Richard's eyes, not fear of the food, but fear of losing control in front of witnesses. That told Calvin everything. "Maya," Calvin said softly, "has anyone gotten sick?" The room held its breath. Maya nodded once. "3 complaints that I know of. Maybe more. A boy last Thursday after waffles. An older woman 2 weeks before that. A man who said his throat felt tight after the French toast. Diane told us to mark them as customer sensitivity and clear the table fast." Diane's face drained of color. "That is not what happened." "You changed the notes," Maya said. "I saw you." The mother in the booth pushed the plate farther away until it nearly touched the wall. Calvin felt anger rise in him, but he did not let it reach his voice. Anger could blur a room. Calm could sharpen it. He took out his phone and opened the private inspection application used by Morning Grace corporate auditors. Richard saw the logo on the screen before anyone else did. His expression shifted so quickly it almost looked painful. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then the beginning of dread. "Where did you get that?" Richard asked. Calvin held the phone low enough that only Richard could see his employee identification credentials loading under the company seal. "From the company that owns this restaurant." Diane took one step back. Evan set the jug down on the counter with a dull plastic thud. The sound seemed too small for the silence that followed. Calvin photographed the jug, the plate, the sauce pitcher, the receipt, and the pancake order ticket still clipped above the line. Then he selected Emergency Food Safety Escalation and sent the report to Corporate Legal, the Board Compliance Office, and the County Health Department contact assigned to the region. Richard tried to recover his voice. "This is a misunderstanding." Calvin looked at him, and the warmth that had been in his face when he spoke to Maya was gone. "No. A misunderstanding is when a server forgets toast. This is unlabeled product in a public kitchen, altered complaint records, and a manager more concerned about appearances than a child's safety." The words moved through the diner like a door opening in a storm. Richard stared at him. "Who are you?" Calvin slipped the phone back into his pocket. He did not answer yet. Not because he wanted drama, but because the truth had one more step to take before it could stand on its own. He looked toward the kitchen doors, where the smell of hot batter still drifted out over the frozen room. "First," he said, "I want the storage room unlocked." Richard Harlan did not move toward the storage room. He stood between Calvin and the kitchen doors as if his body alone could hold back the consequences gathering on the other side. The diner remained almost perfectly still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator case, the soft drip of coffee into a glass pot, and the nervous tap of Evan Miller's fingers against his apron. "The storage room is for employees only," Richard said. It was a weak sentence, and everyone heard it that way. Calvin looked past him toward Maya. "Where is the key?" Maya hesitated, then pointed toward a hook beneath the manager station. Diane stepped quickly in front of it. "She does not know what she is talking about." Calvin turned his eyes to Diane, not angry, not loud, just steady. "Then step aside and let the room prove her wrong." Diane's mouth opened, but no words came out. The mother in the booth stood now, holding her daughter's hand. An older man near the wall lifted his phone, not filming dramatically, just ready, as if he had seen enough to know someone might later deny what had happened. Richard noticed and forced a smile at the dining room. "Folks, we apologize for the interruption. Breakfast is on us this morning." Nobody moved. Free food could not soften the sight of an unlabeled jug sitting on the counter. Calvin reached under the manager station himself and took the key. Richard's hand twitched, but he stopped short of touching him. That choice mattered. A man like Richard understood witnesses. Calvin walked through the kitchen doors, and the world changed from warm wood and yellow light to stainless steel and fluorescent glare. The air was hotter here, thick with steam, fryer oil, and the sweet chemical edge Calvin had tasted on the pancake. Cook stood frozen beside griddles. A dishwasher paused with gloved hands over a sink full of suds. On a prep table, a row of pancakes waited under a heat lamp, each one brushed with the same shiny sauce. Calvin looked at them and felt a quiet sorrow deeper than anger. Food was supposed to be trust made visible. Here, it had become a disguise. Maya followed a few steps behind him, then Evan, then Richard and Diane, though Richard stayed close enough to monitor every word. The storage room door sat at the rear of the kitchen beside a stack of flour bags. Calvin unlocked it. The hinges gave a tired squeak. Inside, the shelves looked organized from a distance, but the order was false. Real inventory sat in front, branded flour, sealed coffee, labeled jam, boxes facing outward like actors on a stage. Behind them, partly hidden under flattened cardboard, were 6 more white jugs. No labels. No dates. No supplier marks. Calvin pulled one forward and set it under the light. The liquid inside was the same cloudy amber. Evan looked down at the floor. Diane whispered, "Oh my God." Richard immediately said, "Those are cleaning supplies." Calvin looked at the shelf directly beside the jugs. A measuring ladle hung from a hook, sticky with the same amber film. Cleaning supplies do not come with food ladles. No one answered. Calvin photographed the shelf, then the jugs, then the shipping box beneath them. On the box, a torn delivery sticker showed only part of a name, Harlan Private Logistics. It was not a Morning Grace approved vendor. It was not in the corporate system. It was Richard's name on a backdoor supply chain. Maya drew in a sharp breath. That is why the real deliveries stopped. Evan finally spoke, his voice small. He said it was temporary. He said corporate did not care as long as the margins looked good. Richard turned on him. Be quiet. Calvin raised one hand, and somehow that quiet gesture carried more authority than Richard's command. Let him finish. Evan swallowed. The first shipment came after the winter audit. We were told to pour it into the old honey bottles if inspectors came. I did not know anyone could get sick. I swear I did not know. Calvin studied him. The young cook looked ashamed, frightened, and guilty in a way that did not need shouting to be understood. Did complaints get deleted? Calvin asked. Evan nodded. Mr. Harlan said bad reviews cost jobs. Calvin looked at Richard, and the final piece settled into place. This was not one careless morning. This was a system built from greed, prejudice, and silence, hidden behind pancakes and polite uniforms. From the dining room came the distant sound of sirens, faint at first, then growing closer along the street outside. The health department had not arrived yet, but emergency responders were coming for the little girl, just to be safe, because her mother had done exactly what Calvin told her and called. Richard heard the sirens too. The confidence drained from his face. Calvin stepped out of the storage room holding the torn shipping label in one hand and his phone in the other. Now, he said, his voice low enough that everyone leaned in to hear it, you are going to open the office computer. The office behind the kitchen was barely larger than a walk-in closet, but Richard Harlan had made it feel like a throne room. His framed certificates lined the wall. A sales chart was pinned beside the desk, each month marked in green whenever costs dropped and profit climbed. There was a leather chair behind the computer and 2 cheap plastic chairs in front of it, the kind reserved for employees who were about to be corrected. Calvin noticed the details immediately, the locked filing cabinet, the shredder with fresh paper dust inside the bin, the small security monitor showing 4 camera angles from the dining room, and 1 blank square where the rear storage camera should have been. Richard stepped inside last, moving slower now, as if every foot of carpet had become deep water. This is confidential management material, he said. Calvin placed the torn shipping label on the desk. Then open it confidentially. Diane stood near the doorway with her arms folded, but the confidence had left her posture. Evan remained in the hall, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Maya stood just behind Calvin, silent but steady, like someone who had been afraid for so long that courage felt unfamiliar in her own hands. From the dining room came the muffled sound of paramedics speaking gently to the little girl's mother. The child was alert, frightened, and being checked as a precaution, but the sight of medical uniforms inside a breakfast restaurant had changed everything. Guests were no longer annoyed. They were watching. They were remembering what they had eaten. They were looking at their plates as if the food had become a question. Richard sat at the desk and placed his hands on the keyboard. "I do not remember the password under pressure." Calvin leaned slightly over the monitor. "Try." Richard typed once. The screen rejected it. He typed again. Rejected. Calvin did not blink. "Maya," he said, "does he forget passwords often?" Maya looked at Richard, then at the monitor. "No, sir." The sir landed differently now, not like fear, but like recognition of authority she could feel before she understood it. Richard exhaled sharply and typed a third time. The system opened. Calvin pointed to the inventory software. Supplier records. Richard clicked through menus with the stiff precision of a man performing in front of a judge. The approved vendor list appeared first: Georgia Valley Honey Cooperative, Blue Ridge Flour, Carter Dairy Supply, all names Calvin knew. Then Calvin asked for the purchase history from the last 90 days. Richard hesitated. "Now," Calvin said. The screen changed. At first, everything looked normal. Regular deliveries. Standard quantities. Clean invoices. Then Maya leaned forward. Scroll lower. Richard froze. Calvin looked at her. "What did you see?" "There," she said, pointing. Manual adjustment. Richard clicked too fast, trying to move past it, but Calvin's hand came down gently beside the mouse. Not touching Richard. Just stopping the moment. "Open that." The adjustment record expanded. 6 weeks earlier, the honey inventory had been marked as damaged and discarded. The replacement line was not tied to any approved vendor. It was entered as local emergency supply, cash reimbursement, manager approved. The approving manager was Richard Harlan. The receiving employee was Evan Miller. The complaint log from the same week showed 3 customer notes, all closed with the phrase "no product issue found." Calvin opened the first complaint. A father had written that his son felt unwell after waffles with honey butter sauce. The original note included the words "strange taste" and "throat irritation." But the visible version shown to corporate had been edited down to customer disliked flavor. Calvin opened the second. An older woman had reported dizziness after French toast. Edited version: customer requested refund for personal preference. The third complaint had belonged to a truck driver who said the syrup tasted chemical. Edited version: customer became rude over pricing. Calvin stared at the screen. His face stayed composed, but his eyes were colder than anything in the walk-in freezer. Who edited these? No one spoke. Calvin clicked the audit trail. Diane Whitmore. Diane's arms fell to her sides. Richard told me to clean up the language. That is all. He said corporate hates messy reports. Richard turned toward her. Do not put this on me. The room tightened. Calvin scrolled farther. Then he found the file that made even Richard go still. A spreadsheet named Margin Recovery Plan. Inside were columns listing projected savings from replacing organic honey, reducing staff hours, prioritizing premium guests, and suppressing avoidable service complaints. One column was labeled Low-Value Customer Impact. Calvin read those words twice. Low-value customer impact. In his mother's restaurant. In the company built from her hands, her recipes, her belief that no hungry person was low value. The sirens outside faded as the emergency vehicle pulled away, but inside the office another sound rose, the quiet ring of Calvin's phone. The caller identification showed Morning Grace Board Counsel. Calvin answered, put it on speaker, and looked directly at Richard. "This is Calvin Brooks," he said. "I am at Brookhaven. Preserve all records, suspend remote access for this branch, and send the emergency compliance team. We have a confirmed integrity breach." Diane covered her mouth. Evan whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Richard stared as if the walls had moved. Calvin finally gave him the answer he had been asking for since the dining room. "And Richard," he said, voice steady as stone, "this is not your restaurant." For 3 seconds after Calvin spoke, nobody in the office seemed to breathe. The name moved through the room without needing to be repeated, passing from Richard's stunned face to Diane's trembling hands, from Evan's lowered eyes to Maya's widening stare. Calvin Brooks. The man from the framed photographs. The founder whose signature appeared on training manuals, vendor contracts, employee handbooks, and every plaque near the front door. The man Diane had seated beside the restroom. The man Richard had tried to remove. The man they had mocked because his jacket was old and his shoes were worn. Outside the office, the dining room had gone quiet again, but this time the silence was different. It was not curiosity. It was recognition spreading table by table as guests saw Calvin step out of the office with Richard following behind him like a man walking into weather he could not outrun. Calvin did not announce himself to the room. He did not need to. The board counsel was still on speakerphone, the company seal was visible on his phone screen, and Richard's face had already confessed what pride would not. The mother from the booth stood near the front window with her daughter wrapped in a blanket from the paramedics. The little girl was safe, shaken but smiling faintly as Maya handed her a cup of water. Calvin looked at that child first. Not at Richard. Not at Diane. Not at the guests holding phones. The child mattered more than the scandal. "Ma'am," Calvin said to the mother, "your meal and medical evaluation will be fully covered by Morning Grace. You will also receive a direct call from our safety office today." The mother nodded, her eyes wet with relief and anger. "I just want to know why this happened." Calvin looked toward the service counter where the unlabeled jug sat under the lights. "So do I." Then he turned to the dining room. His voice was calm, but it carried to every booth. "This kitchen is closed effective immediately. No food leaves this line. If you ate anything with honey butter sauce today, please remain here so your contact information can be recorded for follow-up. You will not be charged for your meals." A few people looked at their plates. Others pushed them away. One older black man, the same man whose coffee refill had been ignored, slowly stood and said, "I told my wife this place changed." Calvin met his eyes. "You were right." Those 3 words seemed to give the man back something the morning had taken from him. Richard suddenly found his voice. "Mr. Brooks, with all due respect, this is being handled too publicly." Calvin turned to him. "You made it public when you served it to families." Diane began crying softly behind the counter. "I did not know it was unsafe," she said. "I only changed the notes because Richard said complaints hurt the branch." Maya looked at her, and there was no bitterness in her face, only exhaustion. "You also laughed at people. You skipped tables. You told us who mattered." Diane had no defense for that. The words hung in the diner heavier than any invoice. Calvin walked to the wall where his mother's photograph smiled over the first Morning Grace counter, her hands dusted with flour, her eyes bright with a kind of hope money could not manufacture. Beneath the frame was the company promise printed in gold, "Every guest leaves with dignity." Calvin reached up and straightened the frame, though it was not crooked. Maybe he needed his hands to do something gentle before they returned to the work of consequence. The front door opened, and 2 county health officials entered with clipboards and sealed sample bags. Behind them came a woman in a gray suit from corporate compliance, breathing hard as if she had driven faster than she should have. Calvin pointed to the counter. "Start with the jug. Then the storage room. Then the office computer. Richard stepped back. I want my attorney present. Calvin nodded. That is your right. The compliance officer looked at Calvin. Do we have reason to believe this is isolated? Calvin thought of the spreadsheet, the strange delivery label, the phrase margin recovery plan, and the partial name printed on the box. He thought of how greed rarely built a single door when it could build a hallway. No, he said. We have reason to believe this may be bigger. Evan, still pale, spoke from near the kitchen door. There were other branches. Every head turned. Richard's eyes closed briefly, as if the last wall inside him had cracked. Calvin stepped toward Evan. Say that again. Evan swallowed. I delivered 2 shipments before. Not just here. Marietta and Decatur. Maybe more. I only drove where he told me. The corporate compliance officer began typing quickly. Richard whispered, You do not understand what you are saying. Calvin heard him, but his eyes stayed on Evan. Do you have records? Evan nodded. In my truck. Text messages too. The room seemed to tilt around that answer. What had begun as a humiliating breakfast had become a map. Calvin looked once more at the diners, the employees, the sealed kitchen, the child by the window, and the photograph of his mother watching over all of it. His voice dropped, not with weakness, but with the weight of what came next. Then we are not closing one restaurant today, he said. We are opening every locked door. By 8:04 that morning, the breakfast rush was over, but nobody inside Morning Grace Diner felt as if the day had ended. The grills were cold. The coffee pot sat untouched. Yellow caution tape from the county health department stretched across the kitchen entrance, bright and strange against the warm wood and framed family photographs. Guests gave statements at the front tables while compliance officers sealed samples in clear bags, labeled containers, copied computer files, and photographed every shelf in the storage room. Richard Harlan sat alone near the counter, no longer speaking like a man in charge. His suit jacket was folded across his lap, his tie loosened, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could still find a way to disappear into it. Diane Whitmore gave her statement through tears, admitting that complaint notes had been changed, tables had been skipped, and certain customers had been treated as if their dignity depended on how much they looked like they could spend. Evan Miller handed over his phone, his delivery records, and the text messages that turned one hidden jug into a chain of names, dates, and locations. Marietta. Decatur. Stone Mountain. Savannah. 17 branches appeared before noon, each one marked by the same emergency supply code, the same edited complaints, the same quiet removal of truth before it could reach the people who needed to see it. Calvin Brooks stood in the dining room while the facts gathered around him like storm clouds. He had spent his life building a company from his mother's recipe, and now that company was showing him where it had rotted beneath the polish. The hardest part was not the money. It was not the scandal. It was the memory of every person who might have sat in a booth and wondered why they were treated like a problem before they even ordered. Maya Johnson moved quietly between tables, helping guests fill out forms, bringing water to the little girl and her mother, speaking gently to the older man whose coffee had been ignored. She had no title that morning, no authority printed on a badge, but she carried herself with the one thing the branch had been missing, care. Calvin watched her for a long moment, then called her over. Maya approached carefully, as if she still expected the world to punish her for telling the truth. You did the right thing, Calvin said. She shook her head. I should have said something sooner. Fear makes people quiet, Calvin said. Courage is when they speak anyway. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Not there. Not in front of the room that had finally learned her name. Outside, 2 corporate vehicles pulled up to the curb, followed by a county car. Richard looked toward the window and closed his eyes. No one cheered when he was escorted out for questioning. There was no need for celebration. Consequence was quiet enough. Diane left separately, her face hidden behind one hand. Evan stayed behind to finish his statement, smaller now, but not invisible. Calvin did not enjoy any of it. A man who enjoyed punishment had forgotten the purpose of justice. Justice was not about making the room feel good. It was about making sure the next child, the next old man, the next tired worker in a faded jacket could sit down and eat without being measured, mocked, or placed at risk. Near the wall, the photograph of Evelyn Brooks still smiled over the dining room. Calvin walked to it again after everyone else had stepped away. He touched the bottom edge of the frame, remembering her hands dusted with flour, her voice before sunrise, her belief that food could tell the truth before people did. She had been right. One bite had told him what reports had hidden. One plate had exposed what profit had buried. One morning had stripped the mask from an entire system. By afternoon, every morning Grace branch in Georgia had received an order to suspend honey butter service until full inspection. By evening, the board had approved an independent review of vendor records across the country. By nightfall, Calvin sat alone at the same small table near the restroom where Diane had placed him, the worst table in the diner, the table meant to humiliate him. Maya brought him a fresh cup of coffee from a sealed machine after the health officials cleared it. "This table should be removed," she said softly. Calvin looked at the hallway, then at the dining room, then at the front door where morning light had first followed him inside. "No," he said. "Leave it." Maya looked confused. Calvin took one slow sip. "Every manager who trains here will sit at this table first. They will learn what it feels like to be overlooked before they are trusted to serve anyone else." Maya nodded, understanding. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Brookhaven, shining on the locked door, the empty booths, and the sign that still promised grace to everyone who entered. Calvin set down his cup, looked at his mother's photograph, and spoke almost too quietly.